youth and what those numbers look like. We will continue to address training needs, and we actually hope to embed dual status training into the statewide training for all new probation officers and the cohort training for all new family case managers. We will be trying to ensure that dual status will be a part of any annual juvenile judges conference as well, to have continued training for the real stakeholders. And then we do hope to have some individualized training or assistance to those local counties where we either have no data or that we can see they're struggling to, that it isn't just a rare occasion that they're missing the screener, that they're, to see if there's some underlying areas that we could assist with. So that's it. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions or comments.
The training that the training you mentioned for both judges that you're looking to implement and also in the family case manager cohort, is that fully developed now, or you hope to have that developed in 22? Or
I think probably the training materials are really fully developed.
Okay, great.
It was, I think, I wish I could have more information for you regarding the surveys from this most recent training. But talking to the committee and those that presented, I think they felt like the questions were high quality. I think a lot of time was put into justice. One of the justices on the Supreme Court gave an introduction about the importance of dual status. And we had judges participate, and then probation and DCS have put together a nice presentation so that the agencies can understand what the limitations and resources are in their respective, so that when they come together to work, they have a little bit of a better understanding of what the role and function of each of those respective agencies are. So no, I don't know that there's a whole lot of development.
That's great.
It's just, continuing to make it available.
Thank you, Judge Malo. It's good to see you
Good to
again.
see you,
I
Judge
just want
Steven.
to comment that in several counties, we have family case managers that only focus on youth that are identified as dual status. I imagine that would be very helpful if we can do that, if we could replicate that in other counties. Has that been your experience, that it's helpful to focus on those family case managers because of the complexities involved with these youth that are dual status?
That would not be a surprise to me if there are some, that if you have the resources to be able to dedicate, certainly bringing those individuals to, so what really happens is once that screener gets completed and a child has been identified as dual status, then I should also have said there was a development in the beginning of all the necessary reporting forms and court orders. The court then can send it out to a local dual status assessment team, and having some expertise certainly in some of those counties probably would be of benefit. I don't know that probation departments have really been able to do that, or every probation officer very well could end up with a dual status case. But a local team then convenes, and they are to come to the table with all the information either agency has regarding that child, and then to make some decisions about how that contact with the juvenile court needs to go forward, whether both probation and DCS need to have cases, if only one should take the lead for a period of time. And then there's an expectation that regardless of who may be filing formal petitions in the juvenile court for a case for a child, there will continue to be that combined coordination of resources and services and assistance.
Justice.
Yeah, I've been looking at the recommendations we're getting ready to hear. There's a real part. It is on. Can you hear me? The recommendations we're going to hear from the Juvenile Justice Reform Task Force, these dual status children with regard to, they're a lot of the ones. Have you seen that report yet? We need to have the dual status group work with, as we implement the recommendations or the legislation that Representative McNamara is going to talk about, because a lot of the data that they pulled show like low and medium risk kids are detention. Some of the kids that are put in detention are sometimes dual status children that should be properly diverted, because we make them worse when we lock them up. The mental health needs of the kids are just spiking all over. So anyway, it's very important we take this group and this resource and work together with overall systemic reform, so that we're not putting low risk, but we don't know where to put 13-year-old in a detention
Right.
facility.
And that, yes, I was part of.
You were, I saw you on the list, the one that worked.
Yes, and so, Janae Hanger presented at a recent meeting that I was able to participate in. And I think there was support amongst the judiciary who recognized that there are some really negative outcomes from detaining younger age youth. And yet at the same time, we also recognize currently, now if we can change systems, that sometimes the court wants to do something to help to, there is a crisis at the beginning and needing some way to still intervene on behalf of the child. So I think there would be, I agree, this work ties in very much with that.
Any other questions?
Director Stigton, may I ask you, am I correct that your agency is involved in undergoing some new software or?
You are absolutely correct.
Okay.
And you are correct about the challenges, which is why we're going through the overhaul right now.
Do
So
we know when we might expect you will have that?
we are hopeful for end of 2022, possibly into 2023.
Okay.
Any other questions, comments from the commission? Thank you, Judge Mallow.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right, moving along to the top billing. We've got, I think, to start because Nina Solomon from the Council of State Governments, who many of us are familiar with, other work with the commission. I think we're going to have her go first and then followed by Representative McNamara to discuss sort of what was adopted yesterday by the task force. But I just ask Nina, if you could, we all have various levels of involvement with the task force moving forward. I think we all know that this was we appropriated funds for it, supported it through this commission. Maybe just if you could just go through, and I think you all have the updated policy recommendations to sort of have a lead in of all the work that's gone in up to this presentation. You can just give a quick sketch just for those watching and for everybody here that's been less involved in some of the agencies or their team, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah. no,
So
thank you.
welcome. Yeah.
Thank you so much and good morning. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a very brief overview of the work that's happened over the last 18 months or so, present some high level findings from our data, and then I'm going to turn it over to Representative McNamara to summarize the recommendations. I also unfortunately have to leave probably around 11-ish to catch a flight, but Representative McNamara will go through the recommendations with everybody.
Great.
So in terms of the work that has happened over the last 18 months or so, we started this assessment in September of 2020 with a preliminary phase where we were tasked with the Juvenile Justice Reform Task Force to really assess the state of data collection on juvenile justice in the state of Indiana, to really look at what data is being collected through what systems at a statewide level, to see if we were to conduct a deeper dive assessment, what data would even be available for us to look at, what outcomes are being tracked across the entire juvenile justice continuum. And the preliminary assessment also sought to identify what would be the priorities for potential change for improvement in the juvenile justice system. In that phase, we conducted focus groups and interviews with stakeholders, and we held 3 task force meetings of the Juvenile Justice Reform Task Force. We then presented a summary report, kind of a final report of the preliminary phase, to that Juvenile Justice Reform Task Force in April 2021 that summarized the key challenges and the key opportunities for improvement. So it summarized what all of the data challenges are in terms of juvenile justice data in the state of Indiana, what data is available to look at a statewide level, where are systems integrated, where they're not, and what would be the key priorities if a deeper dive assessment or an improvement effort were to move forward. As a result of that summary report, resources were allocated during the last legislative session to conduct a deeper dive assessment, and we relaunched the Juvenile Justice Reform Task Force this past summer. And here we outlined just some of the key challenges that were included in that first preliminary phase summary report around data collection, around varying policies and practices for addressing low-risk youth and how diversion functions across the different counties in Indiana. Even though detention, we know, has declined, fewer youth are going into detention in the state of Indiana, that youth are still being detained for non-public safety reasons, a lot of variation in terms of supervision and dispositional practices. And we also looked at how resources are being allocated to fund juvenile justice services and interventions across the state, and saw that there weren't a lot of performance measures being collected, wasn't a lot of intentionality behind how these services were being matched to young people, as well as how they were being funded. And then the data challenges, which I probably don't even need to go into because I think everybody's pretty familiar with those. So we relaunched the task force in August this past summer, being chaired by Representative McNamara and Senator Kreider. That's pretty small to read, but I think everyone can see who is on the task force. Folks were very deliberate to include stakeholders from across the juvenile justice system, across the state, to make sure that there was diverse representation and perspective and geography. And that task force met a total of 4 times, including yesterday's meeting, to vote on policy recommendations for consensus. The task force was responsible for conducting a deeper dive assessment into the juvenile justice system based on that preliminary phase. And in that assessment, we had focus groups and interviews with over 150 stakeholders across the state, including folks from the judiciary, public defenders and prosecutors, probation departments and line staff, each of the Department of Correction facilities, DCS, and others, including youth and families that have experienced the juvenile justice system. In addition to that, we were able to access case level juvenile justice data from a variety of sources. Unfortunately, we are not able to look at the entire continuum of juvenile justice in the state of Indiana because data systems are not integrated. There isn't a unique identifier to look at a young person when they come into the system and follow their case throughout their entire stay in the juvenile justice system. As well, we know that there are different data systems being used in different counties, and those systems are not talking to one another. So what we were able to do is access case level data from 12 counties that are using the Quest case management system. That represents a little bit more than half of the juvenile population in Indiana. And that was to look at courts and probation data. We were then able to look at statewide data through the racial and ethnic disparities data set through the Indiana courts. We were able to look at detention data through the Criminal Justice Institute, which was also a statewide data system. We were able to look at Department of Corrections data, as well as fiscal data from Department of Child Services, looking at juvenile justice services dollars and how those were being spent.
Was all the data collected within the 12 counties that were using the Quest, meaning is the DCS data you pulled just for those 12 counties, or were you pulling?
That was statewide.
Yep, okay, great,
Yeah.
thanks.
So anything that was referring just to the Quest counties had to do with court processes. So referrals, supervision, disposition, adjudication, those types of things, diversion.
Thank you.
And we looked at data from 2015 through 2019, recognizing that 2020 is a little bit of an outlier year, given all the operational changes that had to take place as a result of COVID. We then, after presenting findings to the task force using those data sets and our focus groups and interviews, we also established working groups. So we wanted to make sure that as many stakeholders as possible were involved in the identification and development of these policy recommendations. And so we established working groups that consisted of task force members, but also other line staff and experts from across the state in various fields of juvenile justice, to dive deeper into the data and also to come up with recommendations that would ultimately be presented to the task force for consensus-based approval. We had 4 working groups in operation. We had a front-end working group that was looking at how kids are coming into the juvenile justice system and diversion, and that was co-chaired by Representative Tony Cook and Judge Gaither. We had an out-of-home placement working group that looked at detention, Department of Corrections, and other residential placement for youth in the juvenile justice system. That was co-chaired by Magistrate Robert Van from Lake County Superior Court, and Susan Lightfoot, who's the Chief of Juvenile Probation in Henry County. We had a services working group that looked at the provision and funding of juvenile justice services, both residential as well as community-based services. That was co-chaired by Representative Davis and Christine Curl from Marion County Juvenile Probation. And then most recently, we established a data working group. We didn't have a chair of that working group. That working group met a couple times to think through what would be a potential recommendation for legislation, but that's a working group that will be ongoing to try and address some of the larger data challenges that don't necessarily need to be legislated. All of those working groups met several times over the last few months to look at the data, look at research, look at best practice examples from other states around the country who've addressed similar challenges. And they came up with the recommendations that Representative McNamara will present to you in a little bit. So I just want to go through, look at the data, look at research. Don't like the sound of my voice. So I'll go through just some high-level findings from our assessment. The full presentations, there are 2 presentations of findings that are on the Children's Commission's website that are available, and those meetings obviously were recorded. We presented the data in 2 different presentations. The first focused on the front end of the system, and the second focused on the use of out-of-home placement and services. So the first key finding from our assessment was that in terms of who is being referred to juvenile court, that a lot of kids being referred to juvenile court in Indiana still consist primarily of kids committing low-level offenses. And this data is from the 12 Quest counties, that about 80% of juvenile court referrals in 2019 were misdemeanor and status offenses. We also saw that nearly 1,000 referrals in those 12 counties were for kids under the age of 12. A lot of those kids committing status offenses like truancy, leaving home without permission. There were some kids under age of 12 that were committing more person offenses like battery, but the majority of those cases were misdemeanor or status and low-level offenses. We also saw at the front end of the system that diversion policies and practices varied considerably across the state. That in one county, a young person might be offered a diversion opportunity pre-court, and in another county, informal adjustment might be the only opportunity for diversion that the same young person might have. Additionally, with the use of the Indiana Youth Assessment System diversion screening tool, that tool was not being used consistently across the state to inform diversion decisions. And in counties where that tool was being used, it was being used after a decision had already been made to divert the young person. So again, not being used to inform whether risk of reoffense is a factor in offering diversion to a young person. In terms of adjudications, we saw that even though a lot of those kids that were being referred to juvenile court for low-level offenses never had a petition filed or were adjudicated, it raised the question for the task force and for the working groups of why were these kids then coming to juvenile court in the first place, taking up very limited resources when those resources could be spent more in a better way on those high-risk kids that really are a public safety concern. When we looked at adjudications in those 12 Quest counties, we saw that most cases that were adjudicated and ended up on some form of system supervision on probation, that they also consisted primarily of low-risk youth and kids that were committing low-level offenses. You can see here in 2019, about 56% of juveniles adjudicated in those Quest counties were for misdemeanor or status offenses. We also tried to look at racial and ethnic disparities to the extent possible within the data sets that we had. We calculated a relative rate index to look at disparities. Relative rate index looks at disparities in outcomes for different groups or different populations. Here, outcomes meaning referrals, adjudications, out-of-home placement. If you have a relative rate of 1, that means that there's no disparities. A relative rate greater than 1 means that there is a disparity with regards to Black and Hispanic youth, and a relative rate under 1 means that there is an opposite, I guess, effect, like fewer Black and Hispanic youth having that particular outcome. And what you can see here from the slide is that Black youth are more than twice as likely to be referred to juvenile court as their white peers, and nearly 3 times as likely to be adjudicated. We also calculated relative rate for the use of out-of-home placement and for Department of Corrections. It's not on this slide, but it's in our presentations. And that relative rate was over 3. So as kids get deeper into the system, those disparities are magnified.
Nina. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
What is suspended commitment?
Suspended commitment is kids that are adjudicated to probation supervision with the potential of being committed, but they're not always committed. So it's almost like a threat in a way. I don't want to use that word, but you could be committed at any point during your probation supervision.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Do you mind going back? Can you have the ability to go back another slide? Just, I find this really interesting, just the variety of use of the.
Microphone, please.
Yes, Representative Summers, sorry.
Thank you, Mr.
Thought I was loud enough, but I want the people out there to hear me.
Well, we want them.
Yeah, I know you do. That it says the counties vary in their use of that diversion tool.
Mhm.
But when it's used, it's most often used after a decision to defer has already been made. Can you, for the judges in the room, or functionally, why is that? I mean, that's, I think, just relevant to, I think, some of the recommendations that have come forward on the screening tool. But just as far as what exists now, I assume there's a record that it is used in the court, in the docket. And then what was through all your interviews and things, did you try to understand why? I mean, to me, it seems like the tool is supposed to be used beforehand, obviously, otherwise you wouldn't point it out, but just, did you get it? Is there an explanation for that? Just for the
Yeah.
neophyte?
So in the data, we actually only saw that the tool was being used probably in maybe half the counties where, where we had the data. So it wasn't even being used at all in a lot of the counties. And then, like you said, when it was being used, it was after the fact. The reason for that is that a lot of counties in our interviews and focus groups didn't even have a pre-court diversion option. And they were using the tool to inform, once a kid was on informal adjustment, this is the level of supervision that they needed while they were on informal adjustment. But it didn't inform their decision, well, this is a low-risk kid, maybe we should divert them out of the system in the first place. So it was only used by probation, not by the court, to inform what their supervision would be once they're on.
That's really
that
helpful. Thank you.
supervision.
And Corey, in the end, because like teen court, there's a lot of diversions that are before they even file. But maybe that you're saying there's just 12 Quest counties, just 6 counties had
Yeah.
these pre-court, I mean, teen court, I mean, there's a lot of.
So I'm talking about the data on screening tools was, if I'm remembering, was not just, it was just the Quest counties. Yeah. So it wasn't that, it was not that it was only used, I'm sorry, in half the counties. It was only used on half the kids
Okay.
that were being,
Yes, Senator.
Thank you. On the key findings of the youth of color disproportionately likely to be referred, are these, do we know what level of findings these are? Are these kids that being referred to and adjudicated for low level crimes, or are they higher level? Do we know, based on this ethnic study here, how many are doing bad things versus low level things?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is for all kids. So this is all kids referred regardless of what offense they were being referred for. In order to do that kind of analysis, to really isolate the type of offense, you'd have to do some more like rigorous regression analyses that we just didn't have the time to be able to do. But even when we just looked at the data, it wasn't that kids of color were committing more felonies versus misdemeanors. But in order to really do that type of analysis, you'd have to isolate for those individual factors.
Question I had is on the data, is that all from the Quest counties, this data, the parole adjudication? And
Yes.
if so, what are the counties, what is their county makeup in terms of racial diversity?
That's a great question. I have the list of counties that I can share with the group. Obviously, Marion County is one of them, and some of the large counties. It also consisted of more rural counties. I think it's.
Well, Tippecanoe County, I know, Tippecanoe County is about 9% children of color or population of color.
Do they include Lake or any of the more heavily?
Lake County's on.
Lake County's on there.
Allen County's
Yeah.
on, Lake County's on.
Yeah.
St. Joe.
Yeah, I think if I'm remembering, it was like 5 were large counties. Then there were a handful of mid-sized counties and like 4 rural jurisdictions that were part of the Quest case management system. So it was a variety. It was slightly more, it consisted slightly more of youth of color than the population as a whole of the state. it did skew a little bit in that direction because of Marion and Lake and Allen counties, but there were rural counties included in the Quest data.
Thank you.
So we also looked at detention. The detention data is from the statewide data system from the Criminal Justice Institute log of juveniles detained. And what we saw from our interviews, as well as from the data, is that youth were being detained for non-public safety reasons. A lot of jurisdictions talked about youth being detained for mental health reasons, that they were at risk of self-harm or had suicidal ideation, and they didn't have anywhere else that those kids could be placed. Youth were detained because their parent refused to pick them up or they couldn't locate a parent. Youth were being detained also as a sanction for committing a probation violation. And there were also instances where youth are detained post-disposition as part of their disposition. They might be on probation, but they also get 20, 30 days in detention as part of their disposition. You can see here from the data in terms of youth that were detained pre-adjudication, those that were kind of pre-trial detained, that majority of those kids had committed misdemeanor offenses compared to 40% in 2019 that committed felony offenses of kids being held in detention. We also know from the focus groups and our interviews that not every county is using a detention screening tool to inform decisions around detention. A detention screening tool helps to measure risk of public safety as well as risk of flight from prosecution. We know that the JDI counties and some other counties are using that kind of tool to help inform those decisions, but that is not happening consistently across the state. In terms of Department of Corrections, that youth committed to DOC custody and those facilities consists primarily of moderate risk youth. There are a large proportion of kids that are high risk youth in Department of Corrections, but nearly 60% were moderate risk youth in 2019. We also know that kids are being admitted into Department of Corrections facilities solely for the purpose of receiving a diagnostic assessment. They go into DOC custody, court ordered, for 2 or 3 weeks. They receive that diagnostic evaluation while they're in the facility, and then they receive whatever treatment or services or disposition after that evaluation is conducted. We know that that happens in part because DOC covers the cost of those evaluations. A lot of more rural, small jurisdictions don't have the capacity or the providers to conduct those evaluations in the community or while kids are in detention. But while those kids are in DOC facilities receiving those diagnostics, they're being housed with kids that have been committed to DOC custody, that have committed more serious offenses. Those populations are not separated. And so oftentimes we know from the research that if you put a kid in a situation with other kids that are higher risk, that can make those kids worse in terms of their outcomes as well.
Do they still go to Logansport? Yeah, so I thought they're separated. Logansport isn't a standalone detention facility.
Well, it's all one facility now.
Chris, microphone.
It's all one facility now. So, we don't have the facility, the intake facility on High Street. It's all one facility, but there is a separate unit for those intake kids.
Because
Yes.
there was no, when you have a crisis child and you can't get an acute placement, we have limited options, and the evaluations are excellent. I mean, they were excellent evaluations. So I think working with the mental health standpoint or crisis or substance abuse, we can't get into the community mental health providers for 3 to 6 months. The family's in crisis. There's not, maybe the child will do a 3-day acute stay, and then parents take them to the emergency room. Maybe there's a crime committed. Parents are always happy to get their children in juvenile court. They want to just leave them.
Yeah.
They can't. So there's going to have to be a blend, and I don't know what DOC can do with regard to not making it like a hard time when they do the detention facility. So anyway, that's
Try to not make it a hard time.
Yeah, and you'll you'll see from the recommendations that the language for the recommendation around this was amended yesterday at the task force meeting, because there's an
Yeah.
understanding that you don't want kids to lag 3 to 6 months in detention or in the community waiting for that kind of evaluation.
Right.
So there needs to be some resources and capacity building, but the understanding of using DOC kind of as a last resort for that type of evaluation, that it's not the first kind of go-to.
And I know you're talking about, but it's really paired in the adult system. I mean, jails have become sort of the de facto mental health. While people wait for a competency evaluation, they're in jail for a long time because we can't get to see if they're competent. So they say 70, nationally, 70% of people in our local jails, based on the changes in our mental health system, have a mental health issue or a severe mental health. So anyway, it's parroting what's going on in the adult system as well.
Yeah, and I mean, we can get those reports done in 14 days.
And they're
So,
such good reports.
Yeah, and I mean, we get
Yeah.
awesome feedback from counties, you know, regarding those reports, so.
Yeah, and that's the feedback we got, that that's the reason that counties are going to DOC for that. And then the last finding or section, and again, we're just presenting the very high level one slide data in each of these sections. But we wanted to look at the provision of juvenile justice services, whether that's residential or community-based services to kids that are under supervision in the juvenile justice system. And what we saw is that a lot of the services being provided to young people funded by the state are not necessarily targeted to the unique needs of kids in the delinquency system, that these services often are more geared towards a child welfare population, which we know that there's a lot of crossover, but there is a lot of distinct and unique characteristics and needs of kids that are in the delinquency system. We also know that there's not a lot of quality assurance or data being collected on services provided to young people. It's very difficult to know if those services are effective. There are no performance measures, really hard to know if kids are coming back into the system, if they're successful or completing those services, or even to pinpoint what services each kid is getting while they're under supervision of the juvenile justice system. So very little oversight over the dollars that are being spent on kids in the juvenile justice system in terms of service provision. When we looked at the one pot of money that we had data available to us in terms of the DCS juvenile justice service dollars, we saw that of that funding, 80% of those dollars were being spent on residential services compared to 20% being spent on community-based services. And again, very little information that's available in terms of how those dollars are spent at a county level and what outcomes you're getting for the dollars that are being spent. We know there's local dollars, there's other dollars that are being spent on juvenile justice kids, but this is the largest pot of fund that we had access to data around. We know there's also barriers to these dollars that can't be used for kids that are in diversion pre-court only once a case is actually open for kids that are on informal adjustment or formal supervision. And so a lot of counties were saying that they had gaps in resources to try and develop or expand pre-court diversion opportunities. And also we identified some service gaps, mental health obviously being one that I think every state experiences right now around the country. Also gaps in other more delinquency, services that really target criminogenic needs, aggression, replacement therapy, those kinds of services that are more needed in the community. So those are our key findings. Again, I know I went through them very quickly, a lot more data in all of the presentations, and I'm happy to share. I know I went back and forth with Chris and a few other folks on our task force sharing more specific data points about kids under 12 or anything that you might have more interest in as well.
I'll open it up to questions from members of the commission. Yeah, Director.
So first, just to clarify, because I know you understand it, Nina, but I don't know if the commission understands it. When you look at funding for children in juvenile justice that DCS pays for, residential is going to be higher. It's extremely expensive. You're looking at per diems that range from $400 to $700 a day. This also includes emergency shelters as well. So extremely, extremely high cost. While the number of kids is coming down, it's still going to be the bulk of it because For children that are in residential facilities in juvenile justice, DCS covers all of those costs. For those children that are receiving community-based services, we cover some of those costs. Like Nina said, they didn't have access to all of the data from all of the counties to know exactly what the spend was in community service. So there's a question mark on how much is actually spent on community services, but completely support getting kids out of residential that shouldn't be in those facilities and ensure that they have the programming that is appropriate for them. So does that?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's been a commitment of yours for the non-juvenile justice involved population
Yeah.
for since day one, if not.
Yes. So both,
Yeah,
those
right.
in juvenile justice and those that are identified as
And we've seen
chins.
it drop in residential.
40% in
considerably.
both.
Right.
Yeah, 40% drop for both groups of children.
Right. Yeah, and
So-
to that point, one data finding that I didn't share, I think it was 17% of adjudications to out-of-home placement, DCS out-of-home placement, not DOC, were for low and moderate risk kids. And I think that's the population that we're really talking about that doesn't need to be in residential placement.
Exactly. And so I do have a question, a couple questions. For the recommendations, even though you haven't gone over them yet, are the recommendations focused on those that would be considered status offender, status and what is it? I'm sorry, misdemeanor offenses, or are the recommendations for all the children in juvenile justice?
So the recommendations are systems level recommendations to improve the juvenile justice system as a whole. Obviously, when we're talking about diversion, we're talking about trying to get low risk kids
Okay.
diverted. And that's what a screening tool and those kinds of recommendations would be targeted towards. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Other questions for Nina? Yeah.
One question I was gonna have is that there's not really longitudinal data in here. Is that available? I mean, it would be helpful to know what the trends have been over time in
Yeah.
Indiana, both on diversion as well as residential placement. Are we seeing increases, decreases, et cetera?
Yeah, that is in the presentations. We were able to look at 5 years of data going back to 2015, and everything is going down. Referrals are going down, detention is going down, placement is going down, commitment is all going down.
Arrests
Those
have
are-
gone down.
Arrests are gone down, although we didn't have access to arrest data, but
We have.
but that's a trend that we're seeing nationally over the last decade plus. Everything, the juvenile justice system is shrinking as a whole, and Indiana is mirroring that national trend.
And it's
Representative.
before 2020.
Yeah, yes. Yes, this is going back probably to 2010 even, yeah.
Well, I can understand what you're saying, but then you say that it's not going down for the Hispanic
Exactly.
and
Yes.
African-American population, so then it's not working.
And that's exactly right. And that's what we've seen around the country. Even so before juvenile justice, I worked on school discipline issues and the same thing. We saw a reduction in the use of exclusionary discipline as a whole, but we didn't see a reduction in the disparities and in that gap. And that's the same trend that we're seeing in juvenile justice, that the system is shrinking as a whole, but those disparities have not really changed.
Okay, but it's shrinking as a whole for the white community.
Well, everyone, it's going down still for Black and brown kids, but the disparities between white kids and Black and brown kids has stayed pretty much the same. So for all populations, fewer kids are coming into the system. It's just that the disparity between the groups has not shrunk at all.
As the group talked about, the system diverting kids who are brought in away from the system, was there any discussion around diverting kids from the point of arrest? So in the community, were there diversionary efforts or collaborations talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that was talked about in the front end working group, and Representative McNamara can talk about in the recommendations around diversion. There are some counties where, law enforcement has the discretion to do that right now, that they could bring a kid in or they could divert that kid, warn, release, talk to their parents, et cetera. There are a lot of schools that have school-based diversion programs already. If one of the recommendations goes forward in the legislation in terms of expanding diversion and providing funding for pre-court diversion, there would be nothing to preclude that from happening, from those dollars being used to expand diversion at any point pre-court.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative.
Nina, on the data, is it just 16, 17, 18, and 19 that you're getting the,
It was
Funding.
2015 through 2019.
okay, so 2021, we don't really have any information.
No, because, well, we did the analysis this past year, through this past year. So we wouldn't have had 2021 data completed. And then 2020 was a weird year for many reasons. And so,
And I was
yeah.
told, a lot of places anyway, local law enforcement were told just to stand down and not, do arrests and stuff like that. So I didn't know if that was a part of the downtrend or not. But
Yeah,
that
no,
sounded like
this is going back. I mean, we looked at 2015. When we look at national data, we're going back to like 2010 to see a decline in referrals.
Dr. Dan.
Just one other question. On the declines that we've seen longitudinally over time, nationally and through our state, how does our state's decline compare, including the equity gap, compare to other states? Is everyone pretty much declining at the same rate, or are some states doing it at greater or less? And where are we? in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know because I don't have the data and chart in front of me, but I have a chart that I somewhere. Not every state is declining at the same rate. And the last data I saw, there were 3 states. Indiana was not one of them, but there were 3 states where it was actually going up. But I could get that data to you.
Chris,
That'd be great.
DOC has that data, some, because it used to be, 15 years ago, there's 1,500 children a day in DOC, and then it got down to 400. You closed 2 facilities. What is your daily census now?
About 280.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're down.
Yeah.
Way down. Yeah.
And those are state facilities, not the county facilities.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Right.
You gotta go. Well,
Oh.
Representative McNamara can answer all these
Yeah,
questions.
no, there's nothing that she can't, yeah,
Well,
exactly.
just on behalf of the commission, Nina, thank you. We do hope you make your flight, but we look forward to seeing you again. So.
Our airport's the best. So
You know, I was just gonna say, somebody turn on a siren.
I haven't been away from my baby since COVID. So. Thank you, everyone.
I thank you. Without further ado, Representative Wendy McNamara. Let me say just something real quickly about Representative McNamara and before she worries. She takes on a lot of really difficult and complex issues. And this is really so does Senator Mike Kreider, who's the co-chair. This is no exception. And this has not been probably an easy process, but probably one that has arrived at a result which I think is pretty reasonable based on the findings that Nina just presented. But I'll just say, I mean, everything you do is with kids first in mind. It's what you do on a daily basis. So we just want to thank you for all the work on this. This is outside your normal duties of coming into session and what's before you and what was with you last session. So I just wanted to say thank you for this and for all the commission members that participated in this effort. Without further ado,
I appreciate
Representative
that.
McNamara.
Thank you very much. I felt like it was a third job in the midst of things, but well worth it in the end. I first kind of want to make sure I thanked Nina before she escaped. So she kind of went over the inception, and I was at a conference, Representative Mahan retired, and that jumped me onto a committee I didn't know I was attending, and wound up at a CSG conference in which she was speaking. And I had done attempts, what I call random acts of juvenile justice over the last 10 years. And really what she said resonated with me in trying to make sure in Indiana, we were treating youth the best way we possibly could. And so with that, we get a $50,000 grant from Lilly Foundation to do the first phase. And then the legislature this last session kicked in $250,000 to complete. Fortunately, she'll be with us through June. Her and her team did the majority of this via Zoom, which was a yeoman's job in my opinion. And some of the data that she doesn't have, I recommend if you haven't seen it, please do. She's got charts of Indiana by rural community and really drilled down on a lot of it. But the challenge in all of this has been data. And you know, we're hoping DCS gets theirs done quickly. But with that said, these slides are at a different order than what I did yesterday. So if I get lost, I apologize. So yesterday, we held a 4-hour meeting to vote and talk and discuss and reach a consensus on the legislative recommendations. Nearly all of them were unanimous. Some people abstained and there were a couple no votes on some of the recommendations. Some of the recommendations we just changed totally and went in a different direction with. And then probably one of the main things is just the work of the work groups was phenomenal. Just the dedication, the times that they met, the professionalism. I can't commend them enough for really drilling down on the data and coming up with these recommendations. And all of them presented yesterday in front of us. And then as a group, we, as the main members of the task force, voted on that. And only Joe was the only one. And Chris, sorry, would have been there yesterday. So as she said, it began in September of 2020. Over 100 task force stakeholders have been engaged in one-on-one conversations. What we wanted to make sure is we touched every corner of the state of Indiana in every field of juvenile justice possible. After every task force meeting, I asked my assistant to forward the task force meeting PowerPoint and minutes to every superintendent, principal, probation officer, judge, anybody who touched the system received that after every task force. So they knew what we were doing every step along the way. So the recommendations coming from the work groups are grounded in research and best practices from our state as well as other states. And one of the big things is making sure we're improving the community safety and outcomes for youth. If, and I say if, implemented with fidelity, and that's the key, is making sure that we get all 92 counties on the same page and the same conversation with the same definitions. That's going to be yeoman's work, but it's the work on behalf of youth that needs to be done. So that if I'm a kid in Posey County, Indiana, I have the same opportunities if I find myself confronted with the juvenile justice system as a kid in Marion County. So with that said, the recommendations are going to be delayed. It's going to be a staggered, for best word to use. Some communities will be able to jump on board right immediately and get started. Those counties I would probably identify as our JDI counties. Some of the recommendations, Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. Some of the recommendations can be done immediately as well, but some of them will take time. In some communities, one thing we don't want to do is force a community into whatever these recommendations are before they're ready. It's my expectation that somewhere between 2024 and 2028, we get everybody on the same page. There'll be 2 bills. One this session will lay the foundation of all the recommendations and set up kind of the structure for what this looks like. And then in the 2023 legislative session will be the budgeting cycle. And so if you want to think of it this way, this session will be the policy. Next session will be the budgeting. And any other policy changes we might need to make. And then all of that will be an effective date of December 31st of 2023. But that doesn't mean like all of the implementation is going to effect. It just means we're going to start the process, if that makes sense. So with that said, these are in a different order, so I apologize if I get off track. But as far as diversion and supervision recommendations.
If I could just say something, the slides that you have in front of you are like sort of blacked out, so you just want to use the other document to follow along, or look at the PowerPoint.
And do these match what she's putting up there, or have they
Yes.
changed?
It should, this is as of yesterday.
This is what they adopted. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Representative, go ahead.
And they're not in the same order as they were
Yeah,
yesterday.
I just want to make sure everyone can follow along.
So they're throwing me off today. Okay. So the first recommendation falls under diversion and supervision recommendations. The goal here, if we want to establish a more consistent research-based approach to juvenile diversion. And as you heard her say, there's different methodologies going in different communities. And so we want to make sure that every community is following the same process when it comes to diversion, disposition, and decision-making and supervision. So recommendation number one is to create a statewide definition of diversion that includes pre-court diversion and require that all counties use a validated risk screening tool prior to diversion decision being made. If you remember, Nina talked about some counties aren't using them. Some counties are using them after a decision has been made. So we're going to require the validated screening tool to be used prior to the decision. The screening tool will be used to help inform the diversion decision-making. And then the counties will collect and report annually the state electronic data on the youth diverted, including the demographics, the race, ethnicity, screening information, overrides, and offense program participant completion aid data. We don't have any of this data right now for the most part. So that's why that piece is in there, is to make sure we can have a picture, a snapshot, if you will, of what's happening in real time in the state of Indiana. The screening tool, some counties use IAS. The JDI counties actually create their own, and that's going to be the proposition for us, is to have each community create a screening tool that identifies in their local communities. And talking with JDI folks, on average with counseling, it takes about 9 months to complete that process. So that's why I say this is going to be a different level for everybody.
Oh, Senator.
Well, I guess I'm thrown off by this. We want some consistency, but we're allowing for local flexibility and innovation. And why allow each county to come up with their own, which could have variances related to it, as opposed to one tool that's used consistently throughout all 92 counties.
So each community is going to have their own unique opportunities and challenges. And that's why I said it needs to be with counseling, for lack of a better word. The JDI counties all have their own diversion tool that they use and have used successfully. I don't have the statistics. Chief Justice probably does off the top of her head. It's found to be more successful for those kids when you have community buy-in and community participation in developing those type of screening tools. The IAS, I think, has 5 questions maybe. That's a good tool to use, and they could use that, but there's some deeper questions that can be asked that I believe the JDI County tools ask. And we just want to make sure that you have the community buy-in. If you don't have that, none of this is going to be successful.
I have to follow up. Will there be some fundamental questions that are consistent throughout the entire process, throughout all 92 counties? Will there be 10 questions that are exactly the same, and then the rest can allow for variation?
No.
There are ranges, and when we do it, and it's been a while since I did it, it was a JDI county, but you have a meeting with your law enforcement, community groups, public defender, courts. Like, what are your non-negotiables with regard to child molesting? We're going to detain in jail until we get before the judge. Crimes of violence. And then you've got, we've gone a long way in the last 20 years, like post Columbine, a fight in school, a kid went right to detention. Now we're looking at the risk. So it's, you also have to look at what resources you have available, other, relative placement. So it's a long drawn out, but it's an organized one with parameters with regard to calling a detention risk assessment tool. So you look at what you have in your community, you get all the individuals that touch on and the groups that touch on the groups to come up with where their community level of comfort, because in Posey County, it might be different than a large urban area with regard to what might be available. So Nancy, you're here from JDI. Do you have something to answer on top of that?
Good morning. I just would like to make one clarification. In JDI communities, we work with counties, as Corey knows, to develop a detention screening tool. But in terms of a diversion screening tool, we recommend using the IAS or another tool specifically for that. There is not a diversion tool that we help counties develop. It's just the detention, not just, it's a big deal, but the detention screening tool. So there's a lot of other options for a diversion tool. The IAS would be one. There's the YLSI, there's a couple other ones out there. So just make it clear. Thank you.
And all of those are kind of encompassed in this first recommendation. And I actually recommended at that point also doing what's called a Maisie screening. Mental
screening.
health screening tool at that point as well. It deals more with suicide and mental health prevention there. While it wasn't in the recommendation, I think it's important that at that initial piece or contact with that youth, we're covering our bases. So using the IAS, the locally developed tool, and then a Maisie at contact, I think will give us a better picture of every kid and help us divert more and help us help those that need it most. So that's the recommendation number one, is to really wrap everything we can around a kid with the best knowledge that we have. And make sure that our communities are doing it at the front end and not in the middle or not at all.
But sometimes at the time the child comes into the system, they're also assessing for diversion and detention. That's why I brought up that the detention risk assessment, like where the child should be as a case moves through the court system.
One question I have, and it may just be a knowledge that I don't have, is, so I know we've had challenges with counties submitting data just throughout this. So who's going to oversee whether they do or don't? And then where's the database that all the data will go to? Who oversees it and maintains it?
We are happy to report this month, have the last county coming on. We have a unified case management system now. So we will be able to, it took us 14 years. Good luck. But that was mostly. We had a lot of funding challenges, but we are done. So we're able to pull data like we've not been before. Like when she talked about, you're not gonna be able to skip past on your risk or on your probation intake report. You're gonna have to answer the dual status question. So we will be able to pull that data for all the other counties, not just Quest is a good supplier of data, but we didn't have that unified, but we have that now. We're doing it in we're doing it on pretrial right now. We're doing it on bail reform. The Maisie can be put right in. We have a lot of capacity to build that.
And throughout this whole process, it's been the data that's been the problem. And to have the opportunity to get that and have a real picture. I commend CSG every second of the day for what they were able to parse out to give us what we've got. So hopefully this will give a common language because that common language doesn't exist right now across the state.
Dr. Box?
So the youth that end up diverted before they reach the court system, you will also have that data in your system?
I think if I could, do something that's helped us in probation, explain it to folks in the community is really the probation officers serve as triage officers, and there are different access points. Because we're talking about detention for us in probation, that's the first triage that occurs. So we're making that detention decision. Do we detain? Don't we? Then as they take the next step in the system, we're clearly working with the prosecutors and the public defenders and the judges to make that next triage or access point decision. So even explaining it in the terms of when you go to the emergency room, you hit a triage, decisions are made, and then future decisions are made. Each of those things that we talk about, detention, diversion, deep end, are really those access points for the kids we're serving.
But isn't diversion a first decision that's made, or am I missing the point on this?
Well,
Like
The
you
intake would
started
be an
this-
intake. If somebody gets referred, somebody gets arrested, then it would be referred to probation to do an intake assessment to decide which door.
Okay.
So we are the intake officers of the court under the code. So then making that first decision is, do we detain or don't we detain? Do we divert? Don't we divert? I mean,
Okay.
some of those can kind of be made simultaneously.
And some are made by maybe a police officer that stops and pours a beer out, as opposed to, we really kind of want to go as upstream as possible to looking at how we can divert. So once the police make the referral or have an arrest or the referral, then it comes to probation, then it comes to the court.
Thank you.
I thought diversion the intent was to do it prior to an arrest so that we avoid an arrest. We avoid putting a child in the system.
Well, it could be just a summons, it could be it could be a referral. It could be like with truancy, there's not an arrest with a status offense. With a runaway, it might just be a referral to probation from a different source.
I mean, I thought the whole point of diversion was to keep them out of the system.
Right, but I can only control the ones that once they come to court. You know, if the school has a diversion program, or if there's some other type of program
You don't
before
know
they
about it,
hit.
right?
Mhm.
Okay, that makes sense.
I assume that's also why it's important to have the definition so we know what we're measuring and what we're not, and what we're not, and what we're not, by the way. What is the mechanism to create the definition? Is that something that you're looking at doing statutorily? Is that something that would be taken on by the courts? I mean, I'm, by the way, I think
So,
these are written in a
Give me
way.
5 minutes and I'll give you that answer.
Yeah,
No, we're gonna, 2 slides from now, we're gonna talk about the probation. I'm creating, for lack of a better word, probation task force to create standardizations of definitions and words
Okay.
and things for across the state. So, let me.
yep.
get to that, and I'll
I
get
didn't
in
mean
more
to skip
depth here in a
ahead.
minute.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, and just not to gloss over, the second part is just making sure that it's done prior to the decision for informal adjustment. And then limit it. I believe Joel had questions yesterday, maybe somebody did, about extending it beyond 6 months if you needed to. That was some form of discussion, but ultimately decided local governments will have control, or judges, sorry, over that particular pace. And probably the big thing is eliminating the fees for participation and informal adjustment. That's been something that has come through my committee and was in the interim study committee this fall. And a lot of times they're not even collecting the fees or having the opportunity to have the parents collect the fees. There's no, I want to say less than 30, I can't remember the slide in my head, but it was less than 30% of the fees are actually being collected. So that came to like $2.4 million. And I'm assuming we probably used more in salary resources and trying to track down the fees than actually in collecting the fees. So it just makes sense to do that. That does not eliminate like any type of retribution that might be charged or whatever the judgment might be. These are just the, monitoring fees and things like that.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, they put the rationale up here for me. Okay. So I kind of explained all of this. I can go over it real quick, but it basically makes sure that our counties use this validated tool to inform. It would not stipulate what diversion tool looks like. It would allow that for the local county to make. And then the planning time will be different depending on the county and where they're at in the process. So the next recommendation, well, actually, they're still on there. Okay, is the validate, see, they put them in a different order and they've messed me up. Okay, anyway, so I've kind of covered the validated risk needs assessment prior to the disposition, and then the tool, and then the written report. The important part is making sure that if they choose not to use the tool, or if they choose something different, that in the summary, there's a reason or explanation of why that is chosen not to be used. The other piece is we want to make sure that the local governments, local judges have the opportunity to maintain their jurisdiction. And we don't say that you can't or you can't, we won't. We want to make sure that the decision is commensurate with the safety of the community, the risk of harm to the juvenile or themselves, and those sort of things. We want to make sure if any out of placement occurs. And then the next recommendation, the last one, number 4 on there, is the Judicial Conference of Indiana. In collaboration with their stakeholders, will develop and improve statewide probation standards that are aligned with research-based practices. This is what I'm calling the probation task force. And then if you I think you guys have the same thing I do. If you look at key policy and parameters 1 and 2, those would be the things that this task force, I'm just gonna call it task force, would look at in trying to establish these probation parameters. Some of them are making sure we have everybody using the same language. If we use the term diversion, it means diversion. If we mean, recidivism, it means recidivism, and that everybody is on the same page. So that I think will go a long way, because what we found and CSG found was you might have one community using the term recidivism in a different way than a different community. And I think a lot of that will go a long way in having everybody on the same page, having the same definition, but still giving them the autonomy to do what they need to do in their own community. So those recommendations are just suggestions for what the probation task force could look at, but certainly things that we found through the study that need attention. Any questions? All right, already kind of went over that. All right, so the next one's the out of home placement recommendations. The goal here was to establish more research-based approach. I believe Nina talked about it when local communities are trying to determine what to do with an individual. They aren't necessarily all research-based. It might be what's available or what's accessible at that time in that local community. We want to make sure every child has the opportunity to have the best wraparound evidence-based, data-driven services in their communities. And that's really what this did. Again, talking about the validated detention screening tool prior to detention, giving local flexibility to grade it. And then again, making sure that we're given written confirmation of why or why they did not use this particular tool, and that would come to the legislature. The next one is establishing 12 as the presumptive lower age to use the secure detention. This one had a lot of discussion yesterday. I will say that a lot of good points were made all around and on both sides. We want to still be able to place that individual who needs to be placed. We don't want to say that an 8-year-old who has done something horrific can't be placed in secure detention. So there was a lot of conversation on this particular item. We voted on the concept, not necessarily on what we had written. We took out the whole second half of that particular recommendation and left us with what you see on your page. So to establish 12 as the presumptive lower age for the use of secure detention, so that detention cannot be used for youth under 12 unless for emergency use or unless the court provides findings on written record. So what we did is talk about the concept. We're gonna collaborate more on what this looks like, but it's gonna center around best practices while still giving local autonomy to that. So that we don't wind up with a 5-year-old in secure detention that doesn't necessarily need to be there, right? And so with that, we'll define hopefully the process of what that looks like, but not put restrictive measures on what local communities can do when they need to do it. Hopefully that makes sense. Because there was a lot of discussion on that one.
Senator?
I appreciate affording flexibility and adaptability and all of that, but I'm just concerned that the whole point of what we're trying to do is to bring some consistency. And can there be some kind of, you know how you have CMS and anytime the state wants to put together a new plan or change something, they have to go through CMS. Can there be some kind of oversight group so that when these local communities put these innovative or flexible plans together, that somebody takes a look at it to make sure that it is fair and equitable and.
Yes,
all
that's
those
all
kinds of
part of the
things?
process. It's all part of the recommendations. We're up to that part yet.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But yeah, no, we're just not gonna have the local government say here and let them go. We're gonna have a process and procedures and consensus. Our task force will probably meet another time or two before June. The recommendations are extremely consistent with making sure it's inclusive of everybody across the state. And with that, implemented with fidelity. And to be able to implement something with fidelity, you have to do it with consistency, and you have to do it where you have everybody at the table, making sure everybody understands. So these recommendations right here are, if you will, the verbiage, this is step 1, step 2, step 3. The umbrella will be the process of putting all this together and making sure that the local communities have the resources and the support they need to do all of these recommendations.
Thank you.
Yep, Chris?
Yes, Senator, and to that point, you'll see throughout the recommendations, the use of the term overrides. So meaning when local community doesn't follow a tool, they're going to be tracking those overrides. And so that will, if there's an inordinate number of overrides, you'll say, okay, is there something wrong with the policies locally, or is there a lack of resources locally for some reason? So I think that's how that will be addressed as we move forward. Thank you.
Representative Devon?
Madam Chairwoman, thanks for all the work you've been doing. And I guess on the age, we didn't have an age before recommendation?
We do and we don't. It's based on the criminal activity for the most part. As a general rule, I think it's 10. Most judges will stick by, but there's nothing in statute that basically says you can't. But most judges consistently probably use 10 as their lower level, would be my guess. But there are circumstances where you do have, young kids, they're danger themselves. I authored Paul's Law back in 2012. He was 10, maybe at the time. I don't remember, maybe 12.
He was 12, right? He was
Maybe
12.
12 at the time, and he had murdered his best friend's dad because he thought he was taking his friend away from him. The way the mindset works, you can't ever judge, but we don't have a floor, but there's kind of a
Recommendation.
consistent acknowledgement across the state.
So a 10-year-old could still be incarcerated if this crime was severe enough or caused harm.
Other questions on this one?
Just questioning, it came up earlier, I'm guessing they'd still have the opportunity, if that is the safest place for the child, they would still have the ability to override and do that.
Yes.
Good question. All right.
We're not changing the structure per se of the judicial system. We're changing the methodology, if that makes sense. We're making sure there's communication, people are on the same page, consistency, justice not by geography, but justice by the whole state being on the same page, and putting some things into statute that hopefully through data-driven processes will have better outcomes for our kids. All right, next one is to develop criteria. Now, this was another conversation around use of DOC facilities of the diagnostic assessment. It had a much bigger recommendation prior to this, and we nailed it down to saying criteria of the DOC for, I believe, the reasons presented by Chris. I couldn't see you back there, but I think it was Chris who said it. It's frustrating that you have to confine a kid to DOC to get an evaluation. That's probably one of the most frustrating pieces. And there was a lot of conversation about what this particular piece looked like. And that's why we landed on defining the criteria for what that looks like, rather than saying you can't send an individual to DOC. We're gonna look at the criteria. A lot of that's gonna have to do with, what your local availability is. It could be telehealth. It could be other sources, things like that. But one of the important things we want to make sure is that we create a standardized process. We're not just using any social worker, any psychologist. We're using those that have the juvenile justice and those particular needs, and identifying and certifying contractors or people that can really do these diagnostics. But at the same time, making sure just for reasons of diagnostics only, we're not sending a kid to DOC if it's not absolutely positively necessary. It's, in my opinion, part of a broader problem across the state of Indiana and going all the way back to the development of the adult system 1006. What we always want to do in the state is do the wraparound services and provide those services for kids, but we lack the capacity to do that. And I want to say we graduate maybe one psychiatrist license a year, maybe 200 or 750 social worker licenses a year, maybe 3 to 6 counselor addiction licenses per year. So that's just the whole state. And unless we import them, we're always going to have this gap, I think, between being able to provide those services and for everyone. And I'm not talking about juveniles at this point. I'm talking about adults as well. I talked to the speaker about this piece. We've set up a teacher scholarship program for the pipeline for teachers. I would like to do the same thing for psychologists and social workers. It's the only way I see that we can help even bridge a minor part of this problem. So, and he was receptive to it. So we're going to see, and I don't think it'll be in this bill, but I hope to, with the budgeting bill, include that in there. Because I don't see another way, unless any of you guys have any magic solutions to it, of solving that gap. But that was an extended diatribe on that one. But I just want to say that we landed on developing the criteria because of all of these extenuating circumstances. And then
I think you skipped
So
one.
I have a question.
You skipped one,
What did I
the
say?
reintegration.
Sure.
So Representative McNamara, I just had a question about that too. So if is that specific criteria, are you thinking like for them to come to us for the diagnostic? Because I'm still thinking about a reduction in like resources, like you're saying, in the community. So if there isn't somewhere for them, then you're thinking that would be okay for them to come, no matter if they met that specific criteria or not?
That was probably the entirety of the conversation yesterday.
Okay.
Because that's our struggle, right?
Okay, yeah.
By the way, DOC was given accolades for their processes and their diagnostic in that yesterday. And just, you might have a community with just lack of services. There's just absolutely nowhere else to do that. And you can turn around in 14 days. But unfortunately, we got to send a kid to you for 14 days to make that happen. So then you're in this conundrum. Do I make a kid, sit on probation, sit up, whatever it might be, for 6 months, waiting for a qualified person to assess them? So it's just, there's no easy answer. So that's why we settled on criteria. And we'll have to develop what those criteria are, obviously, but what we're trying to do is give local communities better resources and better options, because right now they don't have that. We still, if we don't do something like this, it's still going to be justice by geography, right? That's why we're looking at telehealth options, looking at other things like that. So
Thank you.
And which one did I skip?
Probably
It's number 7 on the page. It's number 3 on
Number
the
7.
slide. It's
The-
about reintegration services,
Yeah,
reentry
from
services.
DOC.
Okay, so that one, Nancy. That particular recommendation, changed the verbiage from reentry to reintegration. I made the comment that as a school principal, my students would come straight from YCC or someplace right back into the classroom with no services whatsoever. And there is really no formal process for juveniles to come back. And so this is going to be another part of the probation task force, is to look in the reintegration of juveniles and really come up with standards for them so that they can have a reintegration plan into the community, into school. Oftentimes, they're going to have different academics while they're committed. I've worked with several sources, and sometimes if you come back into your school, you might be, let's take world history, for example, you might be a couple centuries off. And so they've missed that whole gap. How do we make up for learning loss? How do we make up for all the other social, emotional wraparound services when they've been in and coming back to the community? And I look at it the same way like with an adult, they need the same type of reentry wraparound services, but we really don't have that for juveniles. So this would provide that for juveniles so that we have a plan that when you reenter, you're just not just going back to school. You're just not picking up where that class is, some sort of educational plan, some sort of plan to kind of, for lack of a better word, like an IEP, but for reentry, reintegration. Okay. They get that covered? Okay, so I have it covered everything on that slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, I kind of covered all the rationale. All right, the data recommendations, probably one of the biggest challenges of this entire process over the last 2 years has been data. And this actually developed recommendations somewhere around, I'd say August or September of this year. That's why they've only met a couple times. And they will continue to meet over the next couple years to come up with a data plan. Now that we have a judicial system that will have a data access, eventually DCS will have access. Hopefully all these can communicate with one another. And so it's my hope that through these data recommendations, we'll be better formed, number one. Number two, be able to help children who a community might have the best of intentions and thinking they have some data-driven process that's working. And in reality, when they drill down to the numbers, it might not be working at all. You might have some communities not using data at all to drive decisions because they have a program that they've used for 20 years and they think it's a great program. We do have some of those. So hopefully through this data group, we'll get all of the inconsistencies and questions answered. And the idea is to put it through the Children's Commission, through your data group, because it's made up of the same people, and really give them direction for what we need on the juvenile level as far as that's concerned. And I've totally lost where I am on this. You're at 10.
I think you're at 10.
Okay. All right, funding and service recommendations. Oh, and just on the data piece real quick, Senator Cordero recommended, I pronounced his name, adding a predictive measure to see kind of like what she was talking about when dual status. is this child going to be more likely to be one of those who's going to find themselves in the system? And if we could figure out a way to do a predictive, do that as well. That's not my. Okay, the last part is the funding and service recommendations. So the funding group actually wanted to come up with two types of funding mechanisms. One, use statewide research-based programs, policies, and practices with the goal of reducing recidivism and improving youth outcomes.
I'm sorry, Representative McNamara. Can we go 1 second back to predictability? That kind of hurts Black and brown kids because they're gonna always be the first. And so they're gonna be, you're gonna always project and predict that they're gonna be in the system because their numbers are already bigger than everybody else. Am I wrong?
I can speak to this a little bit. What we're finding, and I'll just speak based on child welfare and some with healthcare, is when you're looking at predictive analytics, sometimes there's a risk of predicting more often in Black and African-American people that they are at higher risk because of the current data that you have. So you just have to be really careful in the tool that you're using to make sure that you're watching it very carefully. So I don't know if that helps.
It was just a suggestion by Senator Cador. So, you know, it wasn't a recommendation from the task force. It was something that he recommended and the data group could look at.
It's not in there currently.
It's not in there,
not in
no.
the recommendation.
Okay.
currently.
That's good.
Because
Yeah,
that just-
thanks.
That puts us in another whole category.
Yeah, no, it was just something he recommended. All right. So as far as the two types of grants, one would be a block grant for all counties to be used for pre-court diversion for youth that have a low risk of reoffending. So that's trying to get at those status offenses, those, you know, leaving home without permission, those diversion tactics to try to make sure that we're using data-driven risk assessment tools and diversion tools and all that in the communities. And then the second type of grant would be a block grant for research-based, community-based programs to provide cost alternative diversion and detention and incarceration. It would also provide for what we call the reintegration piece when they're coming back from DOC. So two types. One is kind of all counties would apply for the formula-based block grant so that their local communities receive a certain percentage based on what abilities and opportunities they have. And this is kind of where you get, have you followed the instructions of what we want? Have you put together your resource group? Have you developed a tool? Have you done these things? That piece. And actually, I see it happening, helping pay to do those things, right? To put those groups together. And then the second piece is that next piece of being able to do the reintegration, because it's going to be different for every county of what that looks like. My students alone coming back in Vanderburgh County might look different from students coming back in Post County, and they live 10 minutes away. On what's available and what they have there. So what they wanted to do is make sure we covered both bases. And what I recommended was to have JRAC at, can I give it away? have state JRAC. So last legislative session, we created local communities of JRAC. And the Justice Reinvestment Advisory Council. So the local JRACs are made up of all of your local probation, law enforcement, judges, all of those groups of people that are infinitely aware of what's going on in that community. And then we have the state JRAC, which does recovery works, and I don't know what else they do. They do a lot. So that's just a thought. of how to transition this, so that your local communities have everybody already in the right place. The only drawback to that is your local JRACs don't have a designation of a juvenile, or somebody with expertise in juveniles on that. I would have to do one of two things: change the local to add some juvenile expertise, or just stipulate that when applying for the grants, they need to include people with juvenile expertise. So that's probably the simplest and cleanest way to do it, because you touch all 92 counties. You have oversight from the state level, who has knowledge in the justice system, from K to college. So I think that's something that we'll discuss a lot, and something we'll flesh out. And then one of the last ones is a competitive grant for jurisdictions, like specific areas, kind of like you just announced yesterday, the Ready grants or the community grants, regionalism, so that if in one region I have this particular, and they do this to some degree already, but have a regional plan that if I need a certain expertise over here, I already have this combination regionally where I can divert kids to. So 3 types of grants, and hopefully all of those will cover all of these things that we talked about and covered in the recommendations from the task force. And theoretically, if we do all of this, if we make sure everybody's on the same page, if we provide the resources, the funding, all of that, we should see a further decrease in juveniles finding their way into the system, further decrease in recidivism. And in my opinion, you'll see the effects on the adult level. Because if we divert them from the juvenile level, they're not going to make it to the adult level. And so it might take 10 years, 15 years to see the results of this, but you will see results on the adult system by not having somebody who started as a juvenile through the system and going all the way up.
So one quick thing, I applaud you on your thought process on the grants, because that in public health is exactly what we run into, is that we have large amounts of money that we can grant that the locals don't take because they don't have the resources to meet the grant, to write to them, to meet the grants and to follow up the data on it. And they also don't have the expertise in many parts of our state. So providing that regionally, which is exactly what we're talking about with the Governor's Public Health Commission, is I think where you're going to need to be able to make sure everybody has equal access to that.
Director?
So Representative McNamara, transforming a system that involved local, county, state agencies, organizations is a massive effort. So thank you for leading the charge, and I commend you for what you're doing, because I'm sure this has kept you up at night trying to figure out how to approach this. So I just have a question about current programming that's in place. Number 10 sounded a little bit like JDAI, but I could be wrong because that is not my area of expertise. So not just pointing out JDAI, but with current programming or services that are in place, is a plan to try to keep those in place that are working and incorporate them while allowing local jurisdictions to be innovative while having this JRAC type of oversight, pulling all of that together.
Yes.
Wow.
We don't want to break what's working.
Okay.
Yeah. And Nancy could tell you the data from the JDI counties is substantially different from non-JDI counties.
Yeah.
And the numbers of kids who are being diverted versus those that are fighting their way to the system is, I think, and I keep picking on Vandenberg County, but Vandenberg County is 3rd largest, but we have more, I keep wanting to say students, juveniles going through the system than Marion County.
Wow.
And there's a big statistical difference there. So no, it's not my intention to break what's working. And it's my intention to lift everybody else up to the possibilities of what we can do for kids.
So this is really additive, and these would be new resources to be seeking to kind of fill these funding, these programs you're going to set the framework based on these recommendations this session to then look to fill those buckets potentially in the 23 budget.
Okay, so I have a cold in both ears, and if you could repeat what you just said.
These would be funded, these two grant programs would be funded in the 23 budget is following setting up the infrastructure and statute or the architecture and statute this session. Is that right? For these two?
Correct.
Okay.
So what I think we really need is the discussion around that we don't have the data for. And I think that's why that's important, is knowing what local governments are currently spending on these things and knowing what the state will have to make up the difference to be able to implement these. I can't give you a number off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. and I wasn't.
That is currently, DCS. I know, don't be worried. You're good. That number was thrown around earlier, but we know just from their data, there's $124 million in services and residential ish per year, and it could change from year to year. So if we use that number, we know that if things don't change, it'll probably stay that high, right? So we would have to come up with a number like that. If we start implementing these changes and diversions and decreasing residential placements and things like that, you could probably see a tiered system where that number could go down. But I can't put a number on it today because we really don't have all the data pieces, and that's what we hope to really use next year to get.
But the goal is to get increased resources beyond what we have that's working through these programs. And I wanted to ask then, and I think that's great because we've identified counties that just don't have those services. How does that interact with, and I don't know how it would be implemented, the requirement number 7, that all youth committed to DOC custody receive county provided contracted services to support their reintegration. I just, some of these might be out of order because you're going to get a county that's required to provide these services. Are they going to have the funding that you're trying to provide, but it's got a little tail on it for in 11 and 12? How do those interact, if at all, in your mind?
Hopefully it would interact very well. Hopefully I would have, I would apply for the grant that does the reintegration piece, and have worked with DOC to see what that looks like. You'd have to work with your local schools. It's a much bigger picture than just saying DOC alone, right? That's why I think it's important when we talk about having everybody at the table, what this looks like. I would envision the grants being able to help you develop that and then process that.
Okay, that's helpful.
I was thinking too, so essentially you're like almost forcing those counties to
Mhm.
work with DOC to come up with that reintegration plan.
Yes.
Correct.
To make sure they do have those services that'll then be
Yes.
required for those youth.
Yes.
Okay, great. That's helpful.
What will happen to DOC parole then? That's another question.
Well, we still have our adult and juvenile parole are together now. So, we still have adult parole that services juveniles, so.
And I don't want to gloss over the fact that we have that probation task force. And, some of those questions can be answered by them as well. And one of the things we found was just that there is no real system for juveniles to come back, no real consistency, no real wraparound services. Some communities might have it, some communities might not. And the interesting piece, and I have it in my head, is the map of Indiana, and there is no accountability. There's no, you can't put your finger on and say it's rural or urban.
No.
It's different. You can't say it's a rural problem. You can't say it's an urban problem because it's a spotty map everywhere of who has what available to whom. And there's no real explanation for it. But hopefully we get rid of the spotty map and have all access to whatever they need there.
I also want to thank you for your work with this. As a probation officer who often, sorry, I'm a mumbler as well. As probation officers who often do a lot for the court and touch juveniles in a variety of ways through the system, was there conversation about capacity and resources directly to probation officers as we navigate many of the recommendations?
I can't answer that because that working group is the one that made that recommendation. If that's something that's necessary, that's something we can include. You know, when you're talking about capacity, we're talking about capacity on all levels too. But since I'm making you a task force, I would assume we need to build capacity for you in that regard. So that's not a unreasonable ask.
Representative Vaughn.
Yeah, again, Wendy, thanks. The grants and the task force are all based on state facilities and counties both alike, would you say, or are they just focused on the DOC on the state side, or?
Each one has a different agenda. You've got ones that are trying to do local wraparound services with data-driven outcomes, research data-driven outcomes. You've got one that's a regional idea, and then the reintegration one. So you kind of have three things.
The reason
going
I
on.
say that is I have a bill coming this year that's been working with the DOC on eliminating their boot camp. So a lot of the there's 2 state facilities that have boot camp training. And so we have a bill that's going to eliminate the boot camp training. So my questions were, what are we going to replace it with, right? When I was talking to them, and they have a program director that we haven't hooked up yet. So I have a dream of eliminating our state facilities and leaving it all at the county. So everything is back to local. So I just wanted to make sure what we're doing if my dream comes true and we eliminate state facilities and let everything come back to the local level, that it's all focused for that. That would be my concern, I guess.
It would probably work just fine with it. And are you just talking about boot camps, or are you talking all DOC facilities for juveniles?
Just boot camp for now,
Okay.
but I have a dream.
There's a task force for
You have to
another
talk to
day.
Chris about that one.
Well, before we, take DCS out of business, we'll take our juvenile facilities out of business first.
But no, just kind of in conclusion, I can't commend the task force enough for their work and the working groups that did all the work there as well. Many of you here and behind me were on those groups. I want to say thank you to Julie for kind of coordinating everything. She worked with my assistant, and every day I knew what I was going to do, including today, putting me in the wrong order, but that's okay.
That was Amber.
That was Amber. That was okay. Well, yeah. But undertaking something like this was, I feel, necessary in the state to make sure that no matter where you live, no matter who you are, no matter what you do, that you are given the same opportunities that anybody else has, regardless of how you started. So it's my hope that these recommendations, we made some tweaks to them in the discussion yesterday. I have drafted a bill that reflects a lot of these changes. Sometimes some things are still going to be fluid, like design and that sort of thing. But like I said, this will be the foundation for what we do. Next year will be the budget for what we do. And if we need any more foundational changes, we can do that as well. But I'm proud of the work that's gone into this, and I'm proud of the committee for everything they've done to really bring this to fruition. So.
Director Stiggy.
Well, I think at this point, would it be appropriate to make a motion for the commission to adopt the recommendations that we have, even though the task force did, but since you brought them to the commission?
You are a member of the commission and can make a motion. Are you making a motion?
I will make a motion that we adopt the recommendations.
Chief Justice seconds. We will Now, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? The task force's recommendations as laid out are adopted. Thank you, Representative McNamara. We will meet next on February 23rd, and there's a reception to follow right across this wall. So wrap around any way you'd like. Thank you all. Meeting is adjourned.
Oh, let me do that right now for you.
I can't, like, he knows where all the money is. I am, I am contractually obligated to say.
Have a Merry Christmas.
Oh, here, I wish I
And my daughter, I took a picture of this. I made the bow and the dress.
I have lots of local data.
It's a stinker. Oh, my gosh. That's so much fun. I can't wait to do that.
It took us a really long time to get there, but once we got there, the simple data, it directly correlates to what people are talking about.
That question was great about consumption. You're right. That's exactly right. I don't know. You got to get it.
Yeah, no, I think that was it. I mean, we got there through help. State, and so.
I think Nancy's getting really nervous. And if this can happen, some of this stuff is coming down.
Well, like, I'm glad you cleared up the predictive piece.
Yeah.
Because they were just kind of shoehorning some of that stuff, and that is not part of the recommendations. Because that is, I don't know how to do that. I don't know where that came from. That's a slippery slope. That's like, if we're trying to break trends, why are we gonna reinforce them? with a
And if
predictive model? I don't
if there's only one person that recommended it, why did it need to come here?
Yeah, because they thought it was a good recommendation.
Yeah, why did it need to come here? That